After my husband left for a military deployment, my brother-in-law tried to become the man of the house, claiming I was mentally unstable to stay alone. But what happened next was far worse. When Brandon deployed overseas for 9 months, his brother Keith showed up at my door the next morning with a duffel bag and this infuriating grin. "Your sister's worried about you being here alone," he said, pushing past me into the living room. "I'll stay until Brandon gets back." My sister hadn't called me once since the deployment started. Keith made himself at home immediately. He rearranged furniture to improve the energy flow, replaced my groceries with organic alternatives, and installed security cameras in every room except his. "For your protection," he explained. "You're clearly not thinking straight without a man around." He started small, commenting on how I'd burned dinner or forgotten to water the plants, suggesting I seemed forgetful, emotional, too fragile for responsibility. "You should let me handle the finances," he'd say. "Military wives get overwhelmed so easily." I called Brandon whenever possible, but Keith was always there, hovering, interjecting helpful observations about my state of mind. "She's been having trouble sleeping," he'd tell Brandon, "really struggling with basic tasks." Brandon would sound concerned but distant, trusting his brother to keep me safe. After 3 weeks, Keith scheduled an appointment with his therapist friend without telling me. When I refused to go, he told my sister I was becoming delusional and paranoid. She called in tears, begging me to accept help before I hurt myself. Keith started documenting everything. He'd film me crying after difficult calls with Brandon, capture me forgetting where I'd left my keys, record conversations where I sounded stressed or confused. Building evidence, though, for what I didn't yet understand. He convinced my sister to give him power of attorney over my medical decisions, just temporarily, just until I stabilized. One morning, I woke to find he'd thrown out my medications and replaced them with supplements his naturopath recommended. "Your prescriptions were making you worse," he said calmly. That's when I found the folder. I was looking for our mortgage papers when I discovered Keith's meticulous records. Photos, videos, detailed notes about every mistake I'd made, every emotional moment, every sign of instability. There was a draft petition for involuntary psychiatric commitment, and beneath that, documents transferring ownership of our house into Keith's name, with my forged signature. He planned to have me institutionalized while Brandon was deployed, then claim the house as compensation for my care. My hands shook as I photographed everything with my phone. I called Brandon's commanding officer using the emergency contact number, but Keith had already contacted them weeks ago, expressing concern about my mental state. They suggested I seek local support. I tried my sister again. She said Keith was just trying to help and that I was being ungrateful, exactly what he told her I'd say. That night, Keith came home with 2 men in suits. "Social workers," he explained. "They're here to do a wellness check." I showed them the folder, the forged documents, my evidence. But Keith had his own evidence. Months of carefully curated footage showing me at my worst. The social workers exchanged glances. One gently suggested I come with them voluntarily for evaluation. I ran. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and the folder, and I climbed out the bedroom window. I drove to Brandon's mother, Patricia, 2 hours away. But when I arrived, Keith was already there, sitting in her kitchen. "She called to warn me you were having an episode," Patricia said sadly. She'd already called a private facility. They had a bed waiting. I realized then that no one would believe me. Keith had spent months building this narrative while Brandon was unreachable. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to the house at 3 a.m. and broke into Keith's locked bedroom. Inside, I found 3 more folders. Each one contained the same meticulous plan, but with different names, different women, different properties. Keith had done this before, and judging by the newspaper clippings tucked inside, he'd succeeded. The first folder belonged to a woman named Celeste Morrison. Her husband had been deployed to Afghanistan in 2018. Keith had moved in to help her, just like with me. The documentation was identical. Videos of her crying, forgetting things, seeming unstable. Medical records that looked official but came from doctors I'd never heard of. And at the bottom, a death certificate. Celeste had died in a psychiatric facility from what was ruled a suicide. Keith had inherited her house through a will she'd supposedly signed while institutionalized. The second folder was about Virginia Pham. Her partner had been deployed to Iraq. Same pattern, same documentation, same outcome, except Virginia was still alive, according to the clippings. She was in a long-term care facility in Nevada, declared legally incompetent. Keith had sold her house and kept the proceeds as her guardian. The third folder had my name on it. But it wasn't complete yet. He was still building my case, still collecting evidence, still waiting for the perfect moment to execute his plan. I photographed every single page. Then I found something else tucked behind his dresser. A laptop I'd never seen before, password protected. I tried everything I could think of. Finally, on a hunch, I tried Celeste's birth date from her folder. It unlocked. Inside were emails, hundreds of them. Keith corresponded with someone named Dr. Feldman, who ran a private psychiatric facility in Oregon. They had an arrangement. Keith would refer patients, wealthy women whose husbands were deployed or otherwise absent. Dr. Feldman would keep them sedated and compliant while Keith liquidated their assets. They split the profits 60-40. There were also video files, footage from the cameras Keith had installed in those women's homes. Hours and hours of their private moments, their breakdowns, their vulnerabilities. He'd been watching them, studying them, learning exactly how to break them down. I was copying everything to a flash drive when I heard the front door open. Keith was home early. I shoved the laptop back, grabbed the flash drive and the folders, and barely made it to the window before he reached the hallway. I heard him call my name as I dropped into the bushes below. I drove straight to the police station. But when I tried to file a report, the officer looked at me with that same pitying expression everyone else had. "Ma'am, your brother-in-law has already been here. He filed a missing person report 2 hours ago. Said you'd run away and he was worried you'd hurt yourself. He showed us medical documentation that you've been having a mental health crisis." I pulled out my phone, showed them the photos, explained about the other women. The officer glanced at his partner. She asked if I'd been taking my medications regularly, if I'd been sleeping, if I had anyone who could come get me. I realized they thought I was having a breakdown, that I'd fabricated everything because I was paranoid and delusional. Exactly what Keith had planned. I left before they could detain me. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, trying to figure out my next move. Keith had covered every angle. He'd spent months turning everyone against me, building a paper trail that made me look unstable. Even with evidence, no one would believe me. They'd think I'd created fake documents in my paranoid delusion. That's when I remembered Celeste's parents. The folder had mentioned them, how they'd tried to fight Keith's guardianship but lost because the court sided with the medical professionals. If I could find them, maybe they'd listen. Maybe together we could expose what Keith had done. I found them living in a small house in Tacoma. Celeste's mother answered the door, and when I said Keith's name, her face went white. She let me in immediately. "We know," she whispered. "We've always known, but nobody would listen to us." Celeste's father, a retired Army colonel named Walter, had spent the last 4 years investigating Keith. He had his own folders, his own evidence. He'd tracked down Virginia's family, who had similar suspicions but no proof. He'd even hired a private investigator. But Keith was careful. He never left a trail that would hold up in court. But now we had the laptop. We had the emails. We had proof of the arrangement with Dr. Feldman. Walter called Virginia's brother, a lawyer named Philip who'd been trying to get guardianship of his sister for years. Within hours, we had a plan. Philip filed emergency motions in 3 different states, presenting the evidence we'd compiled. Walter contacted a journalist friend who specialized in exposing fraud, and I finally got through to Brandon's unit. Not through official channels, but through a military spouse network that Patricia didn't know about. I sent Brandon everything. Every photo, every document, every piece of evidence I'd found. Keith tried to have me committed that same day. He showed up at the police station with Dr. Feldman himself, presenting papers for an emergency psychiatric hold. But Philip was already there with our evidence. The police had no choice but to investigate. The search of Keith's house turned up everything. More laptops, more folders, more women. Keith had been running this scheme for over a decade, targeting military spouses who were vulnerable and isolated. He'd stolen millions of dollars and destroyed dozens of lives. Dr. Feldman tried to destroy records at his facility, but Walter had already alerted federal investigators. They found women who'd been kept sedated for years, their assets drained, their families told they were too unstable for visits. Virginia was one of them. When they finally cleared the medications from her system, she was coherent for the first time in 3 years. She remembered everything Keith had done. My sister called me crying. "I didn't know," she kept saying. "I swear I didn't know." But I'd found emails between her and Keith. She'd known I wasn't really unstable. She'd helped him anyway because he'd promised her a cut of the house sale. She'd traded her own sister for money. The trial took 8 months. Keith was charged with fraud, forgery, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Dr. Feldman faced additional charges for illegal detention and medical malpractice. 17 women came forward as victims. Some were still institutionalized. Some had lost everything. 3 had died under suspicious circumstances that were now being investigated as possible homicides. Brandon came home on emergency leave. He sat in our living room, the same room where Keith had installed cameras and plotted my destruction, and he cried. He'd trusted his brother completely. He'd believed every lie Keith told him about my mental state. He'd been thousands of miles away while Keith systematically destroyed my credibility and tried to steal everything we had. I wanted to be angry at him. Part of me was. But I also understood. Keith was a master manipulator. He'd fooled everyone, doctors and social workers and police officers. He'd fooled his own mother. Brandon had been in a war zone with limited communication, trusting his family to take care of his wife. The guilt was eating him alive. We started over. We moved to a different city, bought a smaller house, began therapy. Brandon left active duty and took a position training new recruits stateside. He couldn't deploy again, couldn't leave me alone again, even though Keith was in prison awaiting trial. The trust was broken, not between us, but in the systems that were supposed to protect people like me. I testified at Keith's trial. So did 12 other women. We told our stories, one after another, describing how he'd isolated us, gaslit us, turned our families against us, stolen our homes and our freedom. The jury looked sick by the end of it. Keith showed no remorse. He sat there in his expensive suit, the same charming smile on his face, acting like he was the real victim, like we were all just hysterical women who couldn't handle our emotions. The prosecution presented the laptop, the emails, the forged documents. They showed the jury footage Keith had recorded, hours of women in their most vulnerable moments, and his notes analyzing their weaknesses. They brought in handwriting experts who confirmed he'd forged signatures on dozens of legal documents. They brought in financial experts who traced millions of dollars moving through shell companies Keith and Dr. Feldman had created. Keith's defense argued he was trying to help, that these women really were unstable, and he'd done what was necessary to protect them and their assets. That the emails were taken out of context. That the women testifying were still mentally ill and unreliable witnesses. They tried to make us look crazy all over again. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Keith was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Dr. Feldman got 28 years. My sister was charged as an accessory and took a plea deal for probation and restitution, but I never spoke to her again. Patricia visited me months later. She'd aged years in the time since Keith's arrest. I should have seen it, she said. I should have questioned why he was always around during deployments. Always so helpful. But he was my son, and I wanted to believe he was good. She apologized for not believing me, for calling the facility, for almost helping Keith destroy my life. I forgave her, though it didn't erase what had happened. Some wounds don't heal completely. The other victims and I started a support group. We met twice a month, sharing our experiences and helping each other navigate the aftermath. Virginia was there, slowly rebuilding her life after 3 years of being drugged and isolated. Celeste's parents came too, finding some comfort in knowing the truth about their daughter's death was finally acknowledged. We discovered that Keith's scheme had started small. His first victim had been his own ex-wife, a woman named Gabrielle who'd divorced him 12 years ago. She'd tried to warn people about him, but he'd convinced everyone she was vindictive and unstable. She'd died in a car accident that investigators were now reviewing as potentially suspicious. Keith had inherited her life insurance policy. Everything he'd done since then had been a refinement of that original plan. He'd learned from each victim, perfected his methods, identified which doctors and facilities would cooperate for the right price. He'd targeted military spouses specifically because they were isolated, because their partners were unreachable, because society already had stereotypes about military wives being emotionally fragile and dependent. Brandon and I tried to have a normal life, but normal felt impossible. Every time I forgot where I'd put my keys, I panicked. Every time I cried or felt stressed, I wondered if someone was watching, documenting, preparing to use my emotions against me. Brandon installed a security system, but I made him remove the cameras. I couldn't live with cameras in my house anymore, even ones I controlled. We talked about having children, but I was terrified. What if I had postpartum depression? What if I seemed unstable? What if someone tried to take my baby away because Keith had created a permanent record of my supposed mental illness? The medical documentation he'd fabricated was in databases now. Even though it was fake, even though I'd been cleared, the shadow of it lingered. I changed my name, not legally, but I started going by my middle name, Vivian, instead of my first name. I needed to be someone new, someone Keith hadn't touched. Brandon supported it, started introducing me as Vivian to new people. Our old friends understood. Our new friends never knew there had been anyone else before. 2 years after the trial, I got a letter from Keith. It was sent through his lawyer, trying to seem official and intimidating. He wanted me to know he was appealing his conviction. He wanted me to know he still had friends on the outside who believed his version of events. He wanted me to know he hadn't forgotten about me. I burned the letter. Then I called Philip, who assured me the appeal had no merit and that Keith's attempts to intimidate witnesses would only make things worse for him. But the damage was done. Keith still had power over me, even from prison. He could still make me afraid with a few words on paper. Brandon wanted to move again, start completely over somewhere Keith could never find us. But I was tired of running. I was tired of letting Keith's actions control my life. So instead, I started speaking publicly about what had happened. I gave interviews, wrote articles, appeared on podcasts. I used the name Vivian Morrison, combining my new first name with Celeste's last name, honoring her memory while protecting my legal identity. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women contacted me with similar stories. Not always the same elaborate scheme Keith had run, but variations on it. Men who'd isolated them, gaslit them, used the mental health system as a weapon, stolen their assets and their credibility. The common thread was always the same. Society was so ready to believe women were hysterical, unstable, and incompetent that it took very little effort to convince everyone. I started a nonprofit with Celeste's parents and Virginia. We called it the Celeste Project, focused on helping women escape financial abuse and manipulation. We provided legal resources, connected victims with pro bono attorneys, offered grants for women who needed to relocate or file for protection. We trained law enforcement and social workers to recognize patterns of coercive control that involved weaponizing mental health diagnoses. Keith's appeal was denied. Then he tried again, and again. Each time, I had to relive everything. Each time, I had to prepare testimony in case there was a new trial. Each time, Philip assured me it wouldn't go anywhere, but the anxiety was still there. Keith knew exactly what he was doing. He couldn't destroy my life anymore, but he could make sure I never forgot he'd tried. Brandon proposed we renew our vows. He wanted to give me a wedding day that wasn't tainted by Keith's shadow, a day where he could promise again to protect me and mean it differently. We had a small ceremony at a beach in California, just us and a handful of friends. Patricia came and cried through the whole thing. Walter walked me down the aisle because my own father had believed Keith over me, and we hadn't spoken since. During the ceremony, I thought about all the women who hadn't escaped. Celeste, who died alone in a facility while her parents desperately tried to save her. The 3 other women whose deaths were still being investigated. The women who were still too traumatized to come forward. still trapped in Keith's carefully constructed narrative of their own instability. I promised myself I'd keep fighting for them. Life became something different than what I'd expected. I'd imagined being a military wife would mean waiting and homecomings and building a life around Brandon's career. Instead, it had meant fighting for my sanity, my freedom, and my right to be believed. I'd imagined we'd have children and a white picket fence and normal problems like whose turn it was to do dishes. Instead, we had therapy appointments and legal battles and the constant work of rebuilding trust. But we also had something Keith could never take away. We had the truth, we had evidence, we had other survivors who stood with us, and we had each other, scarred but still standing, refusing to let Keith's evil define our entire lives. 3 years after Keith's conviction, Dr. White Feldman died in prison, heart attack, according to the reports. Some of his victims felt relieved, others, like Virginia, felt cheated. She'd wanted him to live long enough to see his medical license permanently revoked, to see the facility shut down, to face civil suits from every family he'd destroyed. His death felt like an escape. Keith sent another letter. This one was different. He wanted to apologize, he said. He wanted to make amends. He'd found religion in prison and understood now that what he'd done was wrong. He wanted to meet with me, to ask for forgiveness in person. Philip advised against it. It's manipulation, he said. He's hoping you'll say something he can use for another appeal, or he wants to upset you. There's no genuine remorse there. But part of me wanted to go. Part of me wanted to look Keith in the eye and ask him why. Why had he chosen us? Why had he been willing to destroy so many lives for money? What had made him into the kind of person who could watch women suffer and feel nothing? Brandon said he'd support whatever I decided, but he also said he didn't think I'd get real answers. Men like Keith don't think like we do, he said. They don't have empathy or remorse. They just have needs and strategies. He'll tell you whatever he thinks will get him what he wants. In the end, I didn't go. I wrote Keith a letter instead. I told him I didn't forgive him and never would. I told him about the Celeste Project, about all the women we'd helped escape situations like the one he'd created. I told him that every day I lived freely and happily was a victory over everything he'd tried to do to me. I told him I hoped he spent every remaining day of his life in that cell, thinking about the evil he'd done and the lives he'd destroyed. Then I sent it and tried to forget about him, but forgetting was impossible. Every time a military spouse contacted our nonprofit with a story of isolation and control, I saw Keith's methods. Every time I heard about a woman being declared incompetent or committed against her will, I wondered if there was another Keith somewhere, running the same scheme. Every time someone suggested a woman was too emotional or unstable to make her own decisions, I heard Keith's voice saying I wasn't thinking straight without a man around. The work was exhausting. Some days I wanted to quit, to focus on my own healing and let someone else fight these battles. But then I'd get a call from someone like Marlo, a Navy wife whose father-in-law had moved in and started isolating her from friends, or Bianca, whose husband's cousin was convincing everyone she had postpartum psychosis so he could get custody of her children. Each story was slightly different, but the pattern was always the same, and each time we were able to intervene before it went as far as Keith had taken it. We won some and lost some. We got Marlo out safely, helped her document everything and file for a restraining order before her father-in-law could establish any legal control. But we couldn't help Bianca in time. By the time she contacted us, her cousin had already gotten temporary custody, and the judge believed his documented evidence of her instability. We were still fighting that case, but it was hard. The system was designed to trust authority figures and documentation, not women insisting they were being framed. Brandon started speaking publicly too. He talked about how he'd failed to see what his brother was doing, how he'd trusted Keith blindly because that's what family was supposed to do. He talked to other military members about the signs of coercive control, about how to really check on their spouses while deployed, about not assuming their partners were being hysterical or emotional when they expressed concerns. Some people appreciated his honesty. Others accused him of betraying his family or making excuses for not protecting me better. We learned to live with the criticism. We learned to live with the fact that some people would always think I was exaggerating or that Brandon was weak for believing his brother could do something so evil. We learned to live with the nightmares and the triggers, and the way certain phrases or situations could send either of us spiraling back to those months when Keith had controlled everything. Patricia sold her house and moved closer to us. She wanted to help with the Celeste Project, wanted to do something good to balance out the evil her son had done. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted her involved, but she was genuinely trying to make amends, and her perspective as a mother who'd been fooled helped us understand how Keith had manipulated his whole family. She became one of our best advocates, talking to other parents about the warning signs they'd missed, the red flags they'd dismissed, because they couldn't imagine their child being capable of such cruelty. 5 years after Keith's conviction, Celeste's mother died. The funeral was small, and Walter asked me to speak. I talked about how she'd believed me when no one else would, how she'd spent years fighting for justice even when it seemed impossible. I talked about how grief had consumed her after losing Celeste, but purpose had kept her going. The Celeste Project was her legacy as much as her daughter's. Walter fell apart after that. Losing his wife and daughter within a few years broke something in him. He stopped coming to meetings, stopped answering calls. 6 months later, he died in his sleep. The death certificate said natural causes, but I knew better. He died of a broken heart, killed by the same man who'd killed his daughter, just slower and less obvious. Keith's parents were both gone now. His brother, Brandon, had built a new life dedicated to preventing what Keith had done. His sister, my former sister, had disappeared after her probation ended, too ashamed to face any of us. Keith had destroyed his entire family along with his victims' families. That realization hit me during Walter's funeral. Keith hadn't just targeted strangers. He'd weaponized his own family connections, used his mother's trust and his brother's deployment to create the perfect cover for his crimes. The nonprofit grew. We opened offices in 3 states, hired full-time staff, and partnered with domestic violence organizations that were starting to recognize financial abuse and coercive control as forms of intimate partner violence. We trained thousands of professionals on recognizing the patterns. We helped hundreds of women escape dangerous situations. And we lobbied for legal reforms that would make it harder for someone to use the mental health system as a weapon. But there were still so many we couldn't help. Still so many women who contacted us too late, after they'd already been committed or declared incompetent, after their assets had been drained and their credibility destroyed. Still so many situations where the abuser was too careful, the documentation too convincing, the legal system too willing to believe that a woman was simply unstable rather than being systematically destroyed. I turned 35 the year Keith's final appeal was denied. All legal avenues were exhausted. He would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. Philip called to tell me the news, and I felt nothing. No relief, no triumph, no closure, just emptiness. Keith's punishment didn't undo what he'd done. It didn't bring back Celeste or the others who'd died. It didn't give Virginia back the 3 years she'd lost or restore the trust Brandon and I had to rebuild piece by piece. Brandon and I finally decided to try for a baby. It terrified me, but I was tired of letting fear control my choices. We went through fertility treatments because the stress of everything had affected my health. Each appointment, each injection, each disappointment when treatments failed felt like Keith winning again. He'd stolen so much from me already. I refused to let him steal this too. When I finally got pregnant, I was simultaneously elated and terrified. Every doctor's appointment felt like an opportunity for someone to document that I was unfit. Every mood swing made me paranoid that I was proving Keith right, that I really was unstable. Brandon held my hand through all of it, reminding me that feeling scared didn't make me incompetent, that hormones and emotions were normal, that Keith's lies had no power over us anymore. We had a daughter. We named her Celeste Patricia, honoring the 2 women who'd fought alongside us and paid the ultimate price. I held her in the hospital and cried, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything. If I hadn't found those folders that night, if I hadn't run when I did, if Celeste's parents hadn't believed me, this moment would never have happened. Keith would have institutionalized me, stolen my home, and I'd have spent years drugged and isolated like Virginia, if I survived at all. Motherhood brought new triggers. When Celeste cried and I couldn't calm her, I panicked that someone would see it as evidence of incompetence. When I felt exhausted and overwhelmed, normal feelings every new parent experiences, I worried I was proving I couldn't handle responsibility. Brandon took paternity leave and we worked through it together, but the shadows of what Keith had done lingered in every moment. Virginia came to visit when Celeste was 3 months old. She'd regained custody of her assets after years of legal battles, though much of the money Keith had stolen was gone. She'd rebuilt her life slowly, finding work as a paralegal, using her experience to help other victims navigate the legal system. She held baby Celeste and cried. "I never thought I'd see something this beautiful again," she said. "After what Dr. Feldman did, I thought I'd lost everything, including the ability to feel joy." We talked about Keith that day, something we rarely did anymore. Virginia said she'd gotten letters from him too, claiming he'd found God and wanted forgiveness. She'd burned them all without reading past the first line. "Some people don't deserve forgiveness," she said. "Some people need to live with what they've done and understand that their victims owe them nothing." I asked her if she ever regretted fighting back, if it would have been easier to just try to forget and move on. She looked at me like I was crazy. "If we hadn't fought, he'd still be doing it," she said. "He'd have found more women, destroyed more lives. We didn't save ourselves, we saved the next victims. That matters more than my peace of mind." She was right, but it was still exhausting. The work never ended. The trauma never fully healed. We just learned to live with it, to build good lives despite it, to find meaning in preventing others from experiencing what we had. Keith died when Celeste was 2 years old. Heart attack in prison, similar to Dr. Feldman. Part of me felt relief. He couldn't send more letters, couldn't file more appeals, couldn't exist as a constant threat hovering in the background of my life. Part of me felt cheated. He'd gotten out easy, dying relatively quickly instead of suffering for decades like his victims had. The other survivors had mixed reactions. Some felt closure, some felt angry. Virginia said she was just tired of thinking about him at all. We held a small gathering, not to mourn Keith, but to mark the end of his story. We shared memories of the women who hadn't survived, renewed our commitment to the Celeste Project, and tried to imagine futures where Keith existed only as a cautionary tale we told to warn others. Patricia took Keith's death hard despite everything. He was still her son. She'd still held him as a baby and raised him and loved him before discovering what he'd become. She struggled with guilt, wondering what she'd done wrong, whether there were signs she'd missed in his childhood. I reminded her that Keith had made his choices. He'd known what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway for over a decade. That wasn't her fault. Life continued. Celeste grew into a smart, curious toddler. Brandon got promoted. The nonprofit expanded. I published a book about my experience which led to more speaking engagements and more women reaching out for help. The story became something I could tell without falling apart. A narrative I'd shaped and controlled instead of something that controlled me. But there were still hard days. Days when I'd see a man who looked like Keith and freeze. Days when I'd read about another woman being declared incompetent or committed against her will and spiral into anger and helplessness. Days when the weight of carrying Celeste's name felt too heavy, like I was responsible for living well enough for both of us. Brandon and I went to couples therapy regularly. We had to. The trauma of what Keith had done to us, the betrayal and the helplessness and the guilt, it didn't just disappear because he was in prison or because he was dead. We had to actively work on trusting each other, on communicating, on not letting Keith's ghost poison what we were building. When Celeste was 4, she asked why she had 2 middle names. Patricia and Morrison weren't typical choices. We'd known this conversation would come eventually. We sat her down and explained, in age-appropriate terms, that she was named after 2 very special women who'd helped us during a difficult time. We told her that sometimes people do bad things and try to hurt others, but good people fight back and protect each other. We told her she carried these names because she represented hope and healing and the future we'd fought to have. She listened seriously, then asked if the bad person was in timeout. Forever timeout, Brandon said. The grown-up version of timeout that you can't ever leave. She seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to playing with her toys. But I knew as she got older, she'd ask more questions. Eventually, she'd learn the full story, and I dreaded that day. The Celeste Project celebrated its 10th anniversary, the year our daughter started kindergarten. We'd helped over 2,000 women escape financially abusive situations. We'd trained more than 15,000 professionals. We'd successfully lobbied for legal reforms in 8 states that made it harder to weaponize psychiatric diagnoses and easier for victims to regain control of their assets. We'd prevented countless women from experiencing what Celeste Morrison, Virginia, and I had endured, but we'd also learned how common these patterns were. Keith hadn't invented financial abuse or coercive control or using the mental health system to destroy someone's credibility. He'd just perfected it, made it more systematic and elaborate. Every week, we heard from women experiencing variations of what he'd done, partners who controlled all the money, family members who told everyone a woman was unstable, abusers who used courts and doctors and police to maintain power over their victims. The work was endless because the problem was systemic. Society was still too ready to believe that women were hysterical, that their emotions made them incompetent, that they needed men to manage their lives for them. Keith had exploited those beliefs brilliantly. He'd known exactly which stereotypes to invoke, which authorities to manipulate, which systems to weaponize. And even with him gone, those beliefs and systems remained, ready for the next abuser to exploit. I thought about this a lot as I watched Celeste grow. I thought about how to raise her to be strong and skeptical and aware without making her paranoid or afraid. I thought about how to teach her that not everyone who offers help has good intentions, but that doesn't mean she should never trust anyone. I thought about how to explain that the world had tried to destroy her mother, but her mother had fought back and won, sort of, in the ways that mattered most. Brandon worried about different things. He worried about deploying again, even though his current position didn't require it. He worried about Celeste being targeted because of who her father was, because military families were still vulnerable to the kinds of predators Keith had been. He worried that he'd miss signs if someone tried to hurt us, that he'd fail to protect us the way he'd failed before. We were both damaged in ways that would never fully heal, but we were also stronger than we'd been before. We knew what real danger looked like. We knew how to document everything, how to trust our instincts, how to fight back against gaslighting and manipulation. We knew we weren't alone, that there were other survivors who understood, who'd stand with us if we ever needed them. Keith's scheme had failed in the end. He'd died in prison, his name synonymous with evil, his legacy one of destroyed lives and broken families. But he'd also succeeded in ways that haunted me. He'd stolen years from all of us, years of peace, of trust, of normalcy. Years we spent fighting him and recovering from him and trying to prevent others from becoming him. Years we could never get back. Celeste started having nightmares when she was 6. Not about Keith specifically, but about people not believing her, about being trapped somewhere she couldn't escape, about authorities telling her she was wrong about her own experiences. The therapist said it was normal for children of trauma survivors to internalize their parents' fears. We were passing our damage on to her without meaning to. We tried to shield her more. We tried to show her that the world was mostly safe, that most people were trustworthy, that she could rely on adults to protect her. But she was smart enough to notice the security system, the way we checked references obsessively before hiring babysitters, the way I tensed when anyone mentioned deployment or mental health or family helping out during difficult times. She knew something bad had happened, even if she didn't fully understand what. The year Celeste turned 8, I got a call from a producer who wanted to make a documentary about Keith and his victims. At first, I said no. I'd told the story enough times. I'd written the book, given the interviews, testified at trials. I was tired of reliving it. But then the producer explained that Keith's case was being studied in criminal justice courses, that Dr. Feldman's facility had become a symbol of systemic failure, that our advocacy work was changing laws and saving lives. The documentary would focus on that, she said, on what we'd built from the ashes of what Keith tried to destroy. I talked to Virginia and the other survivors. Most wanted to participate. We saw it as an opportunity to reach more people, to warn more women, to create permanent record of what had happened and how we'd fought back. Brandon was hesitant, worried about Celeste seeing it someday, but ultimately supported my decision. The filming process was brutal. We had to visit the house where Keith had lived, the facility where Virginia had been held, the courthouse where he'd been tried. We had to watch footage of ourselves from 10 years ago, broken and terrified and fighting for our lives. We had to explain, over and over, how it had felt to have everyone believe we were crazy, to be isolated from help, to know that a predator was systematically destroying us and being unable to stop it. But we also got to show how we'd survived. The documentary followed me through a day at the Celeste Project, showing how we helped women document abuse, connect with lawyers, create safety plans. It showed Virginia working as a paralegal, using her experience to help others navigate legal systems that had failed her. It showed Brandon training other military members on recognizing signs of coercive control. It showed Patricia speaking to parents about believing victims even when the abuser is someone you love. The documentary aired 2 years later. It won awards. It sparked conversations about financial abuse and coercive control. It led to more legal reforms and more funding for organizations helping victims. And it made Keith's name permanently associated with evil, ensuring that even in death, he couldn't escape accountability for what he'd done. But it also meant Celeste learned the full story younger than we'd intended. She was 10 when a kid at school found the documentary online and watched it. They told other kids. And soon everyone knew that Celeste's uncle had tried to destroy her mother, that her family had this dark history, that she was named after women who'd been victimized by someone in her own family. She came home crying, asking why we'd never told her everything, why we'd let her find out from classmates instead of from us. We tried to explain that we'd been waiting until she was older, until she could understand better. But the truth was, we'd been avoiding it. We'd wanted to protect her from the ugliness of what had happened, and instead, we'd left her unprepared and embarrassed. That night, we sat with her and told her everything. We showed her photos of Celeste Morrison and explained how we'd fought to expose Keith. We told her about the other women, about Virginia's strength and Celeste's parents' dedication. We explained why we'd started the nonprofit and why the work mattered. We wanted her to understand that yes, something terrible had happened, but we'd turned it into something meaningful. She asked the question I'd been dreading. If Keith was Dad's brother, does that mean I have bad in me too? Brandon held her tight and explained that Keith's choices were his own, that having someone evil in your family didn't make you evil, that she was named after heroes, not villains, and she got to choose what kind of person she wanted to be. After that, things shifted. Celeste became more interested in the work we did. She started asking questions about how we helped people, what laws we'd changed, how someone could tell if they were being manipulated. At 11, she volunteered at the nonprofit's fundraiser, helping set up chairs and talking to attendees about why the work mattered. She was growing up understanding that bad things happened, but that people could fight back and make things better. Virginia got married when Celeste was 12. She'd met another survivor, someone who understood trauma and healing in ways most people couldn't. The wedding was small but joyful, full of people who'd fought alongside her and supported her recovery. I stood as her maid of honor, thinking about how impossible this day had seemed when I first met her, still foggy from the medications Dr. Feldman had kept her on for years. During her reception, Virginia gave a speech. She talked about how Keith and Dr. Feldman had tried to steal her future, but instead, they'd just delayed it. She talked about the family she'd built from other survivors, about the meaning she'd found in helping others, about refusing to let evil win by giving up on happiness. She thanked me specifically for finding those folders, for running when I did, for fighting even when it seemed hopeless. If you'd accepted what Keith told you, she said, I'd still be in that facility. You saved my life. I'd never thought of it that way. I'd always felt like I'd barely saved myself, like I'd gotten lucky more than anything. But she was right. Every time we prevented another Keith from succeeding, every time we helped another woman escape, we were saving lives. The work wasn't just about healing ourselves. It was about stopping the cycle, about using our pain to protect others. Brandon retired from the military when Celeste was 13. He'd spent his entire adult life in service, but he was ready for something different. He joined the Celeste Project full-time, focusing on outreach to military communities and training on how to support deployed service members' families. His insider perspective was invaluable. He knew how the military culture could be exploited, how isolation could be weaponized, how to talk to service members about protecting their loved ones from predators like Keith. We also finally felt stable enough to consider having another child. Celeste had asked for a sibling for years, and we'd put it off, worried about triggering my trauma or being unable to handle the stress. But we were in a better place now. The nonprofit ran smoothly with paid staff. Keith had been dead for years. The nightmares came less frequently. We felt ready. Our son was born when I was 39. We named him Walter, after Celeste Morrison's father, the man who'd believed me when I had nothing but accusations and suspicions. Walter grew up in a different environment than his sister had. By the time he was born, we'd processed enough of our trauma to be more relaxed parents. We still had security systems and careful vetting of caregivers, but we didn't jump at every shadow the way we had with infant Celeste. Life settled into something resembling normal, though normal for us looked different than for most families. Normal meant annual memorials for Celeste Morrison and the other women Keith had killed. Normal meant speaking engagements and fundraisers for the nonprofit. Normal meant being recognized in public sometimes, usually by survivors or their families who wanted to thank us for the work we did. Celeste decided at 16 that she wanted to be a lawyer, specializing in family law and victims' rights. She'd grown up watching Philip fight for guardianships and protective orders, watching the legal system fail victims and occasionally succeed in protecting them. She wanted to be part of fixing it. Brandon and I supported her completely, though I worried about her carrying this burden so young. But she insisted it wasn't a burden. It was purpose. The 20th anniversary of Keith's arrest approached. 2 decades since I'd found those folders and run out the window. 2 decades since I'd met Celeste's parents and they'd believed me. 2 decades of fighting and healing and building something meaningful from something terrible. The nonprofit was planning a major fundraiser to mark the occasion, and I was supposed to give a speech. I struggled with what to say. How do you summarize 20 years of trauma and recovery? How do you honor the dead without making their stories feel exploitative? How do you inspire people to keep fighting without minimizing how hard the fight is? I drafted versions and deleted them all, feeling like nothing captured the complexity of what those years had meant. The night before the event, Virginia came over. We sat on my back porch drinking tea, watching Celeste and Walter play in the yard. She told me I was overthinking it. Just tell the truth, she said. Tell them it was hell and we survived it. Tell them Keith almost won but didn't. Tell them that every woman we help is a victory, even if we can't help them all. Tell them not to give up. So that's what I did. I stood in front of 500 people and told them about finding those folders at 3 a.m., about running out a window in my pajamas, about being dismissed and disbelieved and nearly committed. I told them about Celeste Morrison dying in a facility while her parents fought to save her. I told them about Virginia spending 3 years drugged and isolated. I told them about the other women Keith had destroyed and the ones he would have destroyed if we hadn't stopped him. But I also told them about the 2,000 women we'd helped since then. About the laws we'd changed and the professionals we'd trained. About the families we'd kept together and the women who'd rebuilt their lives after escaping abuse. About survivors finding joy and purpose and meaning after trauma. About my daughter wanting to be a lawyer and my son growing up knowing women were strong and capable and deserving of belief. I told them Keith had tried to steal my future, my home, my freedom, and my credibility. But instead, he'd given me purpose. He'd shown me that evil existed and that it could be fought. He'd connected me with other survivors who became my closest friends. He'd taught me exactly which systems needed to be changed and how to change them. He'd failed to destroy me, and in failing, he'd created his own worst enemy. The speech got a standing ovation. People donated generously. But the real victory was quieter. It was in the private conversations afterward. Women telling me they'd escaped because of resources we'd provided. Lawyers saying they'd won cases using strategies we'd taught them. Parents saying they'd recognized signs of abuse in their adult children's relationships because of presentations we'd given. Small victories, one person at a time, adding up to a systemic change Keith never could have imagined. That night, Brandon and I lay in bed talking about how far we'd come. 20 years ago, I'd been running for my life, convinced no one would believe me. Now I had a career, a family, a nonprofit that was changing lives. Now Keith was dead and mostly forgotten except as a cautionary tale. Now the systems that had enabled him were slowly, grudgingly changing to make it harder for others like him to succeed. We'd won, sort of. Not completely, not perfectly. Celeste Morrison was still dead. Virginia had still lost 3 years of her life. I still had nightmares sometimes. Brandon still carried guilt for trusting his brother. The damage Keith had done couldn't be undone, only adapted to and built around. But we'd survived. We'd fought back. We'd turned pain into purpose and trauma into meaningful work. We'd raised children who understood that victims deserved belief and support. We'd changed laws and systems and minds. We'd saved lives. In the end, that had to be enough. Because the alternative, letting Keith's evil go unchallenged, letting his victims be forgotten, letting other predators repeat his patterns, that was unthinkable. So we kept fighting. We kept speaking. We kept supporting survivors and pushing for change. We kept living our lives as a testament to the fact that Keith had tried to destroy us and failed. And every day we woke up free and safe, and together was another day Keith lost. Another day his evil didn't triumph. Another day we proved that victims could become survivors, and survivors could become fighters, and fighters could win, even if the victory was messy and incomplete and ongoing. The work would never truly be done. There would always be more Keiths, more abusers using the same tactics, more women who needed help. But there would also be more survivors who refused to stay silent, more advocates pushing for change, more people who'd learned to recognize the patterns and intervene. The battle was ongoing, but we were no longer fighting alone or defenseless. 20 years after Keith tried to destroy my life, I stood on my back porch watching my children play, my husband beside me, my work changing lives, my story preventing others from experiencing what I had. Keith was dead and mostly forgotten. I was alive and thriving and using everything he'd done to make sure others never suffered the same way. In the end, that was the best revenge. Not his death or imprisonment, but the fact that his evil had sparked something good, something that would outlast him and help people long after he was forgotten. He'd tried to silence me, and instead had given me the loudest voice I'd ever had. He'd tried to steal my future and instead had shown me exactly what my future should be. So I kept fighting. For Celeste Morrison and Virginia and all the others. For the women who contacted us every week, desperate for help. For my daughter who wanted to be a lawyer and my son who was growing up in a world we were slowly making safer. For myself and Brandon and the life we'd rebuilt from rubble. Keith had lost. Every single day, in every way that mattered, he kept losing. And we kept winning. One survivor at a time. One changed law at a time. One life saved at a time. That was enough. It had to be.